Welcome to the show. I'm John Idarola. This is actually episode 1 of the show. You know it's an early one because the show doesn't even have a name yet, although it does have a purpose. You might have seen me in the past on other internet shows, both politics and non-politically affiliated shows, TYT University, The Common Room, perhaps on Town Square, or TYT Sports, What the Flick, and the main show, where I do political news. And every week, I prepare shows for the Friday political hour of the Young Turks, and every week, unfortunately, we never get to all the stories. And so I'm going to be covering them by myself each weekend. It's going to serve the purpose of both shedding light on stories that I thought were important enough that I actually prepared graphics and quotes for, but also to give me a little bit more practice, because I don't often do solo shows, and I think that there is some value in learning how to do that. Right now, I host TYT University for the most part, but I have to say that 5-10 years from now, it's unlikely that my entire career will be wrapped up in college-related news. And I do very much enjoy the political news, the world news. Now, the theme for today is going to be military, war, stories of that sort, guns, domestically. I always find those stories very interesting. I'm a huge weapons nerd, a huge military technology nerd. And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. What will we be talking about next week? You never know. It depends on what stories we get to on the Friday edition of the Young Turks. But we're going to be starting off with a very interesting story. You might not be surprised by what's going on, but it is important. So we're going to be starting with Congress. Congress is attempting to force nearly $500 million onto the Army to purchase Abrams battle tanks, and the military is saying, no thanks. And Congress is then saying, no, you have to. You don't often see a battle going on like this. We've had the sequester recently, and part of the sequester was cuts to military funding. And in the past 10 years, both Rumsfeld and now the Department of Defense under President Barack Obama are attempting to save money in the military where they can. But it's extremely difficult to actually do that in practice. And this is going to be an amazing case study of that. So, the Abrams program, what are we talking about? We're talking about $436 million that Congress is trying to appropriate for the purchase of new Abrams tanks and the retrofitting of new electronics gear and other improvements to existing Abrams tanks. Now, the military is saying, we don't need this. Actually, we have a quote from General Ray Odierno. He says, if we had our choice, we would use that money in a different way. Now, you might think, okay, he's a general, and the Army's chief of staff, by the way. He probably knows what he's thinking. But maybe congressmen know better what the military should be doing with its money. So we have a couple of people, mainly in Ohio, but unfortunately this is all over the country, who are lobbying for increased spending on military technology. Today we're looking at the Abrams, but this goes on in dozens of different programs all the time. So Representative Jim Jordan, he is a Republican, but there are Democrats that are doing this too. He says, look, the plant, which we're going to describe, is in the 4th Congressional District, and my job is to represent the 4th Congressional District, so I understand that. But the fact remains, if it was not in the best interests of the national defense for the United States of America, then you would not see me supporting it like we do. So he's one of the men in the House pushing for this money. Now, let's give you an idea of why someone like Representative Jim Jordan, who does not know quite as much about military technology as General Ray Odierno knows, why is he doing this? So you might not be surprised to find out that there's a lot of money in this. And the military contractors, both for the Abrams program and for others, have been very good about spreading their supply lines and their contractors, their subcontractors, all over the country. So here's some details on the program. Just for the Abrams battle tanks that we're talking about here, there's 560 subcontractors, 560 different companies working to produce this one, albeit extremely complicated project. Among those contractors, there's over 18,000 people who are employed. And 40 of the companies, by the way, are in Pennsylvania. There are also a number of extremely important subcontractors that are located in Ohio. So one of them we're going to spotlight is the 5th largest employer in Lima, Ohio. Has 700 employees, and it spent $11 million in lobbying. By the way, also General Dynamics, one of the major contractors who are involved in these programs, also spent $11 million just in 2012 lobbying. So we previously cited that number, 18,000 people working on this project. Now, when you are receiving campaign donations, as Representative Jim Jordan and others, including Democrats, are, that's very important to you. That money is going to disproportionately influence your chances of winning your next election, and so you're going to listen to those people. I don't think that 18,000 people's jobs are unimportant. But if the army is saying we have enough tanks, you might have noticed we haven't been having a lot of recreations of the Battle of the Bulge in our fights against Al-Qaeda. Maybe we don't need to build more of these, but unfortunately we will. So I'm not exactly sure where we're going to go from here on this project. There have been projects in the past that have been canceled despite the fact that there's a lot of support for them, but tons of money have been spent on these tanks. The average Abrams tank in the military's arsenal right now is less than 3 years old, which is mind-blowing to me. On the Young Turks, Steve-O likes to talk about the fact that there are actual there are storage yards for tanks, I believe in Arizona, Nevada, states like that just have thousands of tanks just waiting there. Look, someday we might very well be involved in a conflict with a Russia or a China or an India or something like that, perhaps North Korea, where we would need to ship over tanks. I think we've got enough for now. So, yeah, I don't know exactly where we're going to go from there on that project. This is a pattern that we see over and over. Now, obviously, these congressmen have to support their districts, and major employers are part of their districts. But at some point, there needs to be checks and balances, and if they're going to be disproportionately focused on very local level problems like one plant in Lima, Ohio, then somebody else needs to step in. And you would hope that senators would be able to look beyond this sort of thing, but as I said, both Democratic and Republican senators are also involved in that. So let's turn to guns. We're going to be going over to Arizona. There's going to be an update on a story that Cenk was talking about in the Young Turks earlier this week. So because of a bill that Governor Jan Brewer passed this week in Arizona, the gun buyback program in Phoenix will probably end forever, or at least until we get some sane people in government in Arizona. So you might have heard that there were a number of charity drives to raise money to then be used by the Phoenix Police Department, as is done in many cities around the country, to buy back guns from people who no longer want them. Then the guns would be destroyed. For the last 4 or 5 months, there's been a lot of conflict around this. Back in December, a program like this was going on after the Sandy Hook shootings. They wanted to gather up these guns as a show of support. And to stop something like this possibly from happening in Phoenix, protesters showed up. They got the attention of lawmakers in Arizona who then sponsored a bill. It was passed and signed by the governor to say that if you're going to do these gun buybacks, which apparently they can't stop them from doing at least in the short term, you can no longer destroy the guns, you have to sell them back to gun retailers, which is mind-blowing. They're trying to get guns off the streets, not just let them cycle through a bit more profit for the people selling the guns and then get them back on the streets. So let's talk about a few of the people who are involved in this, a few of the politicians and people in the police. So Phoenix Police Sergeant Steve Martos said, "Obviously, a gun buyback event is an effort to reduce the amount of guns that are out in the community. And if we were to get involved in a gun buyback event and then resell those to an authorized dealer, that again might, defeat the purpose." We have different purposes, though. The people trying to stop children from being shot in Phoenix have a very different thing on their mind than people who are trying to get good NRA ratings or donations from the NRA, either in the House in Arizona or possibly Governor Brewer as well. Mayor Greg Stanton of Phoenix says that this, just 3 or 4 years ago, was not a politicized event at all. You did the buybacks. They happen here in LA all the time. He says, "You don't politicize public safety. You let public safety decisions be made by law enforcement leaders. You gotta, to the extent possible, keep politics out of police practice." So that's not going on. Politics is wholeheartedly in police practice in public safety right now, at least in Phoenix, at least in Arizona. So let's talk about why this is going on. We know why this is going on. There are gun nuts around the country. Some of them happen to live in Phoenix. Now I should say Arizona. Arizona has been a testing ground for some of the most extreme conservative legislation over the last few years. Now, most of that tends to be focused around immigration. I have a feeling some of the people trying to keep guns in the hands of Phoenix and Arizona residents probably are thinking about immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, while they're doing it, but that's not the sole driving force. Guns have become a religion in this country, or perhaps haven't become. Perhaps they have been for decades, for over 100 years. People are obsessed over their guns. They're obsessed over their gun rights. And I think that it's so ironic that if you were to ask somebody, to play devil's advocate, why do you think it's so important to have no restrictions whatsoever on guns? And bear in mind, this isn't even a restriction. These people are voluntarily giving them up. They would say, we need to be able to protect our rights. The Second Amendment is the one that protects all the others, because if the government comes to take away our rights, we can use our guns to stop them. And yet we know what's been going on in this country over the last few years, over the last decade. Your rights have been steadily eroded. And I don't see those people with the Second Amendment stepping up to protect those. They seem incredibly willing to allow the government and private corporations to invade their privacy, to do unlawful searches and seizures, to share their information, to declare people enemy combatants, as happened in Boston just recently, to conduct drone strikes that kill American citizens abroad. They're not speaking up about that. So they say the Second Amendment is intended to protect the others, and yet they seem only concerned in protecting the Second. This is an obsession. And even something as innocuous as giving money to people who no longer want their guns. They're not seizing the guns. They're saying, we will give you $100 for a handgun, $200 for an assault weapon, and you give it to us and we destroy it. That's not good enough. The NRA will not allow that to happen. The politicians that the NRA has bought will not allow that to happen. And unfortunately now Phoenix will not allow that to happen. So despite the fact that the politicians in Phoenix, the police in Phoenix like this, they don't want a Sandy Hook in Phoenix. At least in the next few years, the chances have not dropped and will not continue to drop because of efforts like Jan Brewer and other Republicans who are in the tank for the NRA. We'll keep watching that, of course. It's possible that something like that could be overturned after another national election. But while senators sometimes have a chance on the Democratic side in Phoenix, I don't see state-level politics changing, at least in the next few cycles, unfortunately. But let's continue on with gun politics and try to speculate what will happen in the next few elections based on these sorts of policies and policies that are going on at the federal level. So there was the vote just a few weeks ago on background checks in the Senate. It was shot down. We got our vote, hooray! But it was shot down. And now cycles of polls have gone through over the last few weeks, and we've been trying to find out, both the people who voted for the background checks and those who voted against it, what's going to happen to them. And the data has been very clear so far, and we have new data as well. So 4 new senators are being influenced, we believe, by their votes on background checks. 2 in Louisiana, 2 in North Carolina, and it could not line up better. I love these results because it so clearly shows what happens when senators vote with their desired campaign donations rather than the will of the people. So we've got, let's do Louisiana first. Senator David Vitter voted against the background checks. Mary Landrieu voted for the background checks. Now, I have problems with her all the time, but she was right in this case. So in Louisiana, do people support the background checks? Yeah, they do, actually. So 72% of voters say they favor background checks to only 20% who are opposed in Louisiana. Now, regardless of whether you look at Democrats, independents, or Republicans, those numbers hold out. At least a 2-to-1 margin, even for Republicans in the Deep South. It couldn't really be any clearer than that. But despite that, David Vitter voted against it. Should be noted, he has an A rating by the NRA. Mary Landrieu's is a C. Can't imagine it's going to go up in the near future, at least based on this. Now, she has seen a 6-point improvement in polls. I don't know the specific numbers handy for David Vitter, but he is going down. And when you break it down into the demographics, he saw a very small rise in his support among Republicans, but he dropped in both Democrats and independents. More than 50% of independents say they are less likely to vote for David Vitter now in the future, specifically because of his vote on background checks. Mary Landrieu losing a very small amount of support among Republicans, but gaining both in Democrats and independents. So that's very clear. Let's find out. We look at North Carolina. Will the same pattern hold true? Here we have Senator Richard Burr and Kay Hagan. Senator Richard Burr voted against the background checks. Senator Kay Hagan voted for the background checks. In North Carolina, what do the people think? Well, the people supported, actually, 73% saying they support background checks with only 22% opposed, almost the same exact numbers within a margin of error from Louisiana. Again, regardless, Democrats, Republicans, independents, all supporting it at almost or more than a 2-to-1 margin. And yeah, so the numbers on Senator Burr go down in exactly the same way. When you vote against the background checks, a small number of Republicans will support you, although bear in mind these are Republican senators, for the most part, that are doing this, so they would have had that support anyway, and they're losing out among independents and Democrats. So I don't know if these effects will hold true, if they'll last to the midterm election, if they'll last to the next presidential election, but I hope that they do. I don't want it to take another Sandy Hook, another mass shooting, for the politicians to finally get it through their heads that the mediocre amount of money that they are getting from the NRA is not worth it. Because I don't think that they're primarily driven by the campaign donations by the NRA. I think that it's fear of the ads, it's fear of challengers. This is a common sense bill. It is extremely weak sauce. We should have done much more not 5 months after Sandy Hook or 4 months or whatever it is. We should have done it a week, 2 after. Hell, we should have done it 10 years ago. I don't know what it's going to take for us to get over our obsession with guns in this country. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're even moving in that direction. But I have hope, and I have to say it's somewhat disheartening, the level of support that the average person has for guns. Just people that I know, friends that are otherwise fairly liberal, just go crazy when you talk about any restrictions on guns, as if to limit the number of bullets in a clip or the particular models of guns that you can buy is to say you can't have any guns. I got news for you. If the most hardcore, most liberal, most progressive gun bill had passed the day after Sandy Hook, you would still be able to go hunting. You'd still be able to shoot an intruder with a pistol or a shotgun. Very little would have actually changed. And so it's unfortunate that we weren't able to get any actual work done on the federal level. Now, much more was done in individual states, so that's positive. But right now, at the very least, we can look at these polls and say maybe there will be a price to pay for these senators who voted against background checks the next time they go up for election. So that's all the gun news we've got for you this week. In the wake of Sandy Hook, I did not expect, or I should have said before Sandy Hook, I would not have expected that we'd be covering guns so constantly. But it's important. Lots of people die. It's not the most important issue in the country, but it is an important one. And so we will continue to cover it. Now, for the last couple of stories that we're going to do on this first episode of my show, we're going to be turning to Israel for a little bit of good news and a lot of bad and questionable news. So, Wadi al-Malay is a village in Israel. It is in Area C, an area of the West Bank controlled entirely by Israel. But up until just this last week, it was just Palestinians were living there. That is no longer the case. They have been evicted by the military. It is now being converted into a military firing range and training ground. Now, the military says it already was in a firing range and training ground, but people had been living in it up until recently. Those people have now been moved out. We've seen this happen over the last couple of years. It happens quite frequently. Areas are bulldozed either to make way for Jewish settlers or for military practices, and then possibly later on for Jewish settlers. And so that happened. Back in January, there was another village that was cleared out. Now, the residents did come back just 2 days later, but by the time they got back, over 90 buildings had been demolished. Now, look, Israel is not a particularly large country, and it does need room to practice military maneuvers, tank coordination, and things like that. I don't doubt that. But I think it's interesting to note that, let me get the exact number, 18% of the West Bank is currently designated as a firing range for the Israeli military. Now, it's hard to picture exactly what 18% is, how much that is, but I can tell you how significant it is. It is the same size as Area A, the area of the West Bank controlled entirely by Palestinians. So the entire Palestinian people, firing ranges for the military. Are we surprised? I mean, I don't know what I expected. We've had a series of elections over the last decade there. We've seen attempts to moderate and to modernize the governance of the Palestinians, and yet still things like this happen. Now, I know that I have my own particular stance. I'm going to view these stories through a particular lens, and I always want to give the benefit of the doubt to the Israeli government because they're in an incredibly hard situation. But sometimes I feel like these moves are made simply to remind the populations in these areas that you are being controlled, you are being occupied. Don't imagine that you can develop these areas and hope for a better life 10, 20, 30 years down the line. If we want to come in, we will come in. We will destroy your buildings. By the way, not just the structures are blown up. Wells have been destroyed. Walls have been destroyed. I hope that they got good firing practice out of it, I suppose, if these people's buildings had to be destroyed. But it seems pretty malicious. It seems pretty unnecessary. And we're trying right now, by the way, both in Israel and efforts by the U.S. to rekindle the peace process. But things like this continue to happen. The military says that they have the right to do this, but I think that the people living there have a right to some sort of stability. Perhaps in the next few years we can make some headway on the peace process, maybe move these people back into these areas, or at least secure more areas where they know in 1 month, in 6 months, in a year, this will not simply be an area to be trampled by Israeli tanks. A little bit more Israeli military news. This is perhaps a little bit more positive. I'm going to try to end this story on a positive note. Israel has declared that they will end the use of white phosphorus munitions for concealing troop movement. Now, you don't often hear about white phosphorus in the news, so I will describe it at least a little bit. White phosphorus can be used both for weaponized and non-weaponized purposes. For weaponized purposes, it can be put in bombs, in mortar rounds, in short-range missiles, and when it explodes, the phosphorus within fragments into tiny little slivers, tiny little fragments of phosphorus that are then distributed over an area, and they do a lot of damage. In the weaponized versions, the phosphorus causes intense burns to human flesh. It also ignites non-living matter. But one of the reasons it causes such horrendous wounds to people is that it will stick to the skin, it'll stick to the flesh, it'll go deep within, burning skin and the underlying tissue. There are pictures if you want to Google white phosphorus weapons, and they're pretty horrendous. They're certainly not safe for work. Now, there are also non-weaponized versions of white phosphorus, like what we're talking about with Israel right now. White phosphorus, when it burns in a non-weaponized form, produces a great quantity of smoke, better than many alternatives. And so it can be used to conceal troop movements, the movements of tanks and things like that. It can also be used, as I sort of alluded to earlier, for burning non-living matter, like, for instance, vegetation and things like that. So up until previously, it had been used for both weaponized and non-weaponized purposes. Now, the UN watch groups and other human rights watch groups and people who watch over military conduct had said that Israel had been using white phosphorus, at least in some circumstances, in its weaponized forms to kill Palestinian fighters. Now, we don't know anything yet about what will happen with those, but at least Israel is saying they will not be using white phosphorus for its non-weaponized uses like concealing troop movements. So that's progress, I guess. I would like us to ban the use altogether. Now, they're saying they're going to replace it with an entirely gas-based alternative. We don't have any details of what exactly that will be. But it seems like we have bans on chemical weapons in the US, worldwide. I have a feeling that that technically is a chemical weapon. I'm not a scholar of military weapons or the technology therein, but it seems like that's a chemical weapon. But anyway, but bear in mind that while they're not using the non-weaponized versions, they will still have or give to themselves the right to use the weaponized forms. This is a particularly horrendous weapon. It is as far from a smart bomb as possible because by its very nature, it maims people if it does not kill them. It causes horrendous disfiguring injuries. It burns down homes, it burns down vegetation, trees, and things like that. It had previously been used for that purpose. It can be used in so many different capacities. I understand why they want to keep the ability to use this weapon, but the fact that they are making clear that they are reserving the right to use it in its weaponized capacity, I think is a bad omen for the future. I think the U.S. should set an example. Other Western societies should set an example that weapons like this are horrendous. They shouldn't be used. Now, obviously, every weapon, at least in some form, is horrendous. We need to move past war to the extent that we can, but these chemical weapons need to be banned as well. So that's all the time we have, all the stories I had prepared for Friday on the Young Turks. This was the first episode of my solo news show now. For whatever reason, all of the stories were either military or gun related. That will not be the case in the future. Probably going to be covering pretty much whatever I want. But anyway, both the full show of this and the individual clips will be going up on my personal channel. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more in the future. If you have suggestions for stories, feel free. And I'll see you next week with another episode.